Valentine's Day. A time for love, for connection, but sometimes it's a time for something darker, something that lingers in the shadows, waiting. This story happened to me. It's not something I talk about often, but every year, around this time, I can't help but feel that presence again, that feeling of being watched, followed, hunted. It was February 14th a few years ago. I was driving home late at night after visiting my girlfriend. We'd had a fight, and I was upset, distracted. The road I took was a shortcut, Lover's Lane, they called it. A narrow, winding stretch of asphalt that cut through the woods. It was deserted, just me and my headlights slicing through the darkness. At first, everything seemed normal, quiet. But then I noticed something. A figure standing on the side of the road, just standing there, motionless. I slowed down, thinking maybe they needed help. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't facing the road, they were facing the woods, and they were completely still. Like a statue, I rolled down my window, called out, "Hey, you okay?" No response, just silence. And then, slowly, the figure turned their head, not their body, just their head. And they looked right at me. I couldn't see their face, it was too dark. But I felt it, that stare, cold, empty. I hit the gas and drove off, my heart pounding. I told myself it was nothing, just some weirdo messing around. But then I saw them again, a few miles down the road. Same figure, same stance, facing the woods. This time, I didn't stop. I just kept driving, faster and faster. But no matter how far I went, they kept appearing. Every few miles, always the same, always watching. By the third time I was panicking, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I couldn't understand how they were getting ahead of me. There were no side roads, no shortcuts, just this one long, endless lane. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was in the road, right in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. And for a moment, we just stared at each other. Me, frozen in fear. Then I still couldn't see their face, but I could feel it. That same empty, cold stare. And then they started walking toward me, not fast, not slow, just deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. I threw the car into reverse, backing up as fast as I could, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, they were gone. Just gone. I didn't stop driving until I got home. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that figure, that stare, and the way they kept appearing, no matter how far I drove. The next day, I went back to Lover's Lane. I don't know why, maybe to prove to myself it was just my imagination. But when I got there, I found something on the side of the road, right where I'd first seen the figure, a single red rose, fresh, like it had just been placed there, and next to it footprints leading into the woods. I never went back after that. I told the police, but they didn't find anything. No figure, no rose, just nothing. But sometimes late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. And when I look, there's nothing there, just the darkness and that feeling, that cold, empty stare. I don't drive down Lover's Lane anymore. But I wonder if I did, would I see them again, waiting, watching? And I can't help but ask myself, were they following me that night? Or were they waiting for me all along? Valentine's Day is supposed to be about love, but sometimes love can lead you to places you shouldn't go. Places that don't want you there. This story happened to a friend of mine, Sarah. She told me about it years ago, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something unnatural was watching her that night. Sarah and her boyfriend, Mark, had planned a romantic hike for Valentine's Day. They wanted to get away from the city, to spend some time alone in nature. They chose a trail deep in the woods, one that was supposed to be secluded, peaceful. But from the moment they stepped onto the path, something felt. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the sound of their footsteps and the wind moving through the trees. Sarah tried to brush it off, but Mark noticed it too. He kept looking over his shoulder like he was expecting to see something. But there was nothing there, just the trees and the shadows. They'd been hiking for about an hour when they heard it. A whisper, faint, almost inaudible, but definitely there. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah stopped, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she asked Mark. He nodded, but neither of them could tell where it was coming from. They kept walking, trying to ignore it, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. By now the sun was starting to set, casting long, twisted shadows across the trail. Sarah wanted to turn back, but Mark insisted they keep going. "It's just the wind," he said. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers were forming words now. Words they couldn't quite make out, but they sounded angry, desperate. And then they heard their names. Sarah froze. "Mark, we need to go now." But before they could move, they saw it. A figure standing between the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was tall. Too tall. And it was watching them. They turned and ran, the whispers following them, growing louder and more frantic with every step. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. Sarah was crying, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the door. Mark kept looking back at the woods, his face pale. "Did you see it?" Sarah asked. He nodded, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at the trees like he was waiting for something to come out. They drove home in silence. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that figure, heard those whispers. The next day, they went back to the trailhead, hoping to find some explanation. But when they got there, the trail was gone. Overgrown, like it hadn't been used in years. And at the edge of the woods, they found something. A single red ribbon tied to a tree branch. It looked old, weathered, but it hadn't been there the day before. Sarah never went back to those woods. She tried to forget about what happened, but she couldn't. Every now and then she'll hear a whisper when she's alone. And sometimes, when she looks out her window at night, she'll see a shadow moving between the trees, watching, waiting. Mark broke up with her a few weeks later. He wouldn't say why, but Sarah thinks it's because of what happened that night. She says he changed after that. He became distant, like something was following him. And then, one day, he just disappeared. No note, no explanation. Just gone. Valentine's Day is a time for romance, for connection. But sometimes love can lead you to places you never expected, places that shouldn't exist. This story happened to a woman named Emily. She told me about it years ago, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something unnatural was waiting for her behind that door. Emily had just moved into a new apartment. It was a small, cozy place in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Perfect for starting fresh after a tough breakup. But from the moment she stepped inside, something felt off. The air was too still, too heavy. And then there was the door. In the back of the apartment, there was a door. A red door. It was old, the paint chipped and peeling, and it didn't match anything else in the apartment. Emily tried to open it, but it was locked. She asked the landlord about it, but he just shrugged. "It's always been locked," he said. "No key, no way to open it." Emily tried to ignore it, but the door, it bothered her. She'd catch herself staring at it, wondering what was on the other side. And then, one night, she heard something. A faint knocking, coming from the other side of the door. Emily froze, Her heart was pounding. She told herself it was just the pipes or the wind. But then it happened again. 3 knocks, louder this time. And then a voice whispering her name. She backed away, her hands shaking, and didn't sleep that night. The knocking didn't stop. It happened every night, always at the same time. 3 knocks, a whisper. Emily tried everything, earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping on the couch, but nothing worked. The sound always found her. And then on Valentine's Day, something changed. Emily was alone, trying to distract herself with a movie when she heard it, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside her apartment. She turned, her heart in her throat, and saw it. The red door. It was open, just a crack. And from the darkness beyond, she heard it again. Her name, whispered in a voice that wasn't human. Emily didn't stay to see what was on the other side. She grabbed her keys and ran, not stopping until she was miles away. She never went back to that apartment. She left everything behind, her clothes, her furniture, even her cat. She couldn't risk opening that door again. But sometimes, late at night, she'll hear it. 3 knocks, a whisper. And she'll wonder, what was on the other side of that door, and why did it know her name? Valentine's Day is supposed to be about love, about connection. But sometimes the road to love can take you somewhere darker. This story happened to a man named Daniel. He was driving home late one Valentine's night on a stretch of highway he'd driven 100 times before. But that night, the road felt different, like it didn't want him there. It was around midnight. The highway was empty, just Daniel and his headlights cutting through the darkness. He was tired, his mind wandering when he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a hitchhiker, but as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The figure was wearing a long, tattered coat, their face obscured by a hood. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the road. Daniel slowed down, unsure what to do. And then the figure turned, not their body, just their head, and they looked right at him. Daniel hit the gas, his heart racing. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew. That wasn't a person. He tried to shake it off, but the image stayed with him. That face, or lack of it. Just darkness under the hood. He kept driving, telling himself he'd be home soon. But then he saw it again, the same figure, standing on the side of the road, same coat, same stance, and again they turned their head, watched him pass. Daniel's hands were shaking on the wheel. He couldn't understand how the figure was getting ahead of him. There were no exits, no side roads, just this endless stretch of highway, and then he saw it a third time. This time, the figure was in the road, standing right in his path. Daniel slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. And for a moment, they just stared at each other. Daniel, frozen in fear, the figure, motionless, silent. Daniel didn't wait to see what happened next. He threw the car into reverse, backing up as fast as he could. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. Just gone. He didn't stop driving until he got home. He didn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about that figure, that empty hood, and the way it kept appearing, no matter how far he drove. The next day, Daniel went back to the highway. He doesn't know why, maybe to prove to himself it was just his imagination. But when he got there, he found something. On the side of the road, right where he'd first seen the figure. A single red rose, fresh, like it had just been placed there. And next to it, footprints leading into the woods. Daniel never went back to that stretch of highway. He told the police, but they didn't find anything. No figure, no rose, just nothing. But sometimes, late at night, he'll wake up to the sound of footsteps outside his window. And when he looks, there's nothing there, just the darkness. And that feeling, that cold, empty stare. Valentine's Day is supposed to be about love, about warmth. But sometimes love can't protect you from what's out there. This story happened to a woman named Claire. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, a place she thought was safe. But on one Valentine's night, she learned that safety is an illusion, and that some shadows aren't just shadows. Claire had just gotten home from a date. It hadn't gone well, and she was feeling lonely, vulnerable. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the rain. That's when she saw it, a shadow, moving across her backyard. At first, she thought it was a tree swaying in the wind, but then it stopped, right outside her window. Claire froze, her heart pounding. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination. But then it happened again. A tap on the window. She stood up, her hands shaking, and peered outside. The yard was empty, just the rain and the darkness. She locked the window and drew the curtains, trying to calm herself down. But deep down, she knew something was out there. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow, heard the tap. She told herself it was just the storm, but then she heard it. A voice, whispering her name. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, coming from outside her window. Claire didn't move. She just lay there, her heart racing, listening to the voice. It wasn't human. It was too low, too guttural. And it kept saying her name. Over and over. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial 911. But when the police arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just nothing. Claire tried to forget about that night. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But then it happened again, and again. Every night, the shadow would appear, the tapping, the whispers. She started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. The shadow was always there, watching, waiting. One night, Claire couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to confront whatever was out there. But when she reached the spot where the shadow always stood, she found something, a single red rose, fresh, like it had just been placed there, and next to it footprints leading to her window. Claire moved out the next day. She didn't tell anyone why, she just left, but sometimes, late at night, she'll wake up to the sound of tapping on her window, and when she looks, there's nothing there, just the darkness, and that feeling, that cold, empty stare.